My name is Evelyn Klein. I am 31 years old. I had driven up to the lakeside cottage in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for a quiet autumn long weekend, the kind where the only sounds are leaves skittering across the water and the occasional call of a loon. The place belonged to the family in the loosest sense, a shared asset that had always been presented as something we all had a stake in, even if the actual decisions never quite reached me. I told myself the solitude would help me think clearly about the small ways I had been feeling pushed to the edges lately, the conversations that happened just out of earshot, the plans that were announced after they were already set. I was not expecting anyone else. But the truth has a way of arriving uninvited. Barbara Porter pulled into the gravel drive just after noon on the first day. She was a family friend who had known my parents since before I was born, the sort of woman who brought potato salad to every gathering and never raised her voice above a concerned murmur. When she knocked, I almost let it go unanswered. Something in the set of her shoulders told me this was not a casual drop-in. I opened the door anyway. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and stood in the middle of the small living room, twisting her car keys in both hands. "Evelyn, I drove all the way up here because I can't keep quiet any longer," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like she had rehearsed the sentence 100 times on the road. "Your father and your older brother made an agreement years ago. A quiet one. They decided how family resources would be handled and how much say you would have in any of it. They left you out on purpose." I motioned to the kitchen table. We sat across from each other while the light shifted across the water outside the window. Barbara kept her eyes on her hands as she spoke. She told me the agreement had started small, just after my grandfather passed, when there were a few accounts and a piece of property that needed managing. My father had said it would be simpler if decisions stayed between the two of them because I tended to see complications where there weren't any. My older brother had agreed without hesitation. Over the years the understanding had grown. They made choices about investments, about who was consulted on repairs or sales, about how information was shared at family gatherings. They framed it as protecting everyone from unnecessary worry. Barbara had watched it happen at holiday dinners and phone calls she was never meant to overhear. She had stayed silent because she believed it was not her place to interfere in family matters. I listened without interrupting. The words landed one after another, each one slotting into a space I had refused to examine before. I asked her, calmly, why she was telling me now. She looked up then, and for the first time her voice wavered. "Because I've seen what it's doing to you. You keep showing up. You keep assuming the best. And they keep deciding what you're allowed to know. I can't watch it anymore." She left soon after. I walked her to the car and thanked her for the drive. My voice stayed even. When her taillights disappeared down the road, I returned to the porch and sat for a long time. The cold air moved across the lake in steady ripples. I thought about every time I had defended my father's choices to myself, every time I had told my older brother he was only being practical. Loyalty had felt like the right response. It had kept the family intact on the surface. Now the surface was cracking, and the view underneath was smaller than I had allowed myself to see. The next day was the housewarming party at my Aunt Susan Vargas's place, a short drive along the shoreline. I had already accepted the invitation weeks earlier. Part of me wanted to stay at the cottage, but another part needed to see whether the pattern Barbara described would show itself when other people were in the room. I drove over in the late afternoon. The house was already full when I arrived. Relatives stood in clusters on the deck and in the living room, holding plates of food and glasses of cider. My Aunt Susan pulled me into a hug and pressed a warm mug into my hands. My mother was near the kitchen island, laughing at something one of the cousins had said. My father and my older brother stood by the fireplace with two uncles, their heads tilted toward each other in that familiar way that meant a conversation was already decided before anyone else joined it. I moved through the rooms the way I always did, saying hello, asking about work and kids and the drive up. I kept my tone light. My older brother noticed me when I joined a group near the windows. He smiled the small, closed smile he used when he was about to steer something. "Evelyn," he said, loud enough for the others to hear, "you always want to turn every family decision into a full committee meeting. Some of us just need to move forward on the practical things." One of the uncles chuckled. My father nodded once, the way he did when he agreed without wanting to say the words out loud. The remark was delivered with the same calm he used for everything. It was not shouted. It was not even particularly cruel on its own. But after Barbara's visit it felt like a confirmation rather than a surprise. I did not argue. I took a sip of the cider and changed the subject to the new deck railing my aunt had installed. My older brother watched me for a moment longer, then returned to the conversation with the uncles. Later, as the light faded and some of the guests began to leave, I stepped into the hallway to find my coat. My older brother was there, phone to his ear, his back half turned. He was speaking quietly, but the words carried. "She'll make it complicated if we tell her now," he said. "Better to handle the transfer on our end and explain it after it's done." Dad agrees. There was a short pause. She's always been the one who needs protecting from the details. I stood still. The phone call ended. He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned. When he saw me, his expression did not change. He gave a small nod, the same one he had given at the fireplace, and walked past me into the living room. I found my coat, said goodnight to my Aunt Susan, and left. The drive back to the cottage took longer than it should have. Leaves blew across the road in the headlights and stuck to the windshield for a second before the wipers cleared them. I kept both hands on the wheel and breathed evenly. The cold detachment I had felt since Barbara arrived was still there, but underneath it something steadier was forming. I had spent years being the person who kept the peace, who assumed every exclusion was an oversight rather than a choice. That version of me was finished. I parked in front of the cottage and sat in the car for a while after the engine was off. The lake was black and flat. Inside the cottage the lights were off. I knew the weekend still had hours left in it. There would be more conversations, more moments where the old pattern tried to reassert itself. I also knew I would not meet it the same way I had before. The truth Barbara had carried up from the city had changed the shape of the weekend. What I did with that truth was still undecided. But the decision would not be made for me this time. The next morning the light came through the cottage windows in thin gray strips across the wooden floor. I had not slept much. Every time I closed my eyes I heard my older brother's voice from the hallway at my Aunt Susan's house, low and certain, deciding what I was allowed to know. I made coffee and carried it out to the porch. The lake was still, the leaves on the surface barely moving. I sat there for a long time, letting the cold air settle the thoughts that kept circling back to the same place, years of small exclusions that had never been accidents. My phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. It was a text from my older brother. Short, the way he preferred. "Dad and I are handling the northern property transfer this week. No need to get involved. We'll update everyone once it's done." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down without replying. The old version of me would have called immediately, asked for details, offered to help so I could prove I was steady enough to be trusted. That version felt far away now. I was still sitting there when the phone rang. Charlotte Hayes, my closest friend outside the family. She had texted the night before after I left the party early, asking if I was all right. I had answered with one word, fine. She was not the sort to accept that for long. I picked up. "Evelyn," she said, "I was going through some old family group messages this morning trying to find a photo my mom sent, and something played by accident. A voice memo from a couple months ago. I think you need to hear it." She did not wait for me to agree. There was a short pause, then the sound of my father's voice, slightly muffled like the phone had been on a table between them. My older brother answered him. The words were clear enough. She'll turn the whole thing into a discussion about fairness, my father said. You know how she gets. Better to keep the decisions between us and present it as already handled. My older brother laughed once, short and dry. Exactly. She's loyal enough that she'll go along once it's done. We've managed the resources this way for years. No reason to change it now. The recording stopped. Charlotte's voice came back, careful. I didn't mean to play it. It was just there in the thread. I thought you should know. I thanked her. My voice stayed level. We talked for another minute about nothing important, then I ended the call. The recording had not surprised me as much as it confirmed what Barbara Porter had already told me. Hearing it in their own voices, casual and unhurried, removed the last small space I had left for doubt. They had not been protecting me from complications. They had been protecting their control from my questions. I walked down to the water's edge. The rocks were slick with early frost in the shaded spots. I stood there until my hands were cold, then went back inside and called my father. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the kitchen table so I could keep my hands free. He answered on the third ring. Evelyn, he said, the same even tone he used for everything. I assume this is about the text your brother sent. It is, I said. And about a few other things. There was a pause. In the background I could hear movement, then my older brother's voice, quieter, asking who it was. My father did not answer him directly. We can talk about the property later, he said. It's all straightforward. No reason to make it larger than it is. I told him I had heard the recording. I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated the words I had heard my father and my older brother say to each other about keeping decisions between them because I would make things emotional. I asked if that had been their agreement all along. Another pause, longer this time. My father cleared his throat. That conversation was private. You weren't meant to hear it. I know, I said. That's why I'm asking now. My older brother came onto the line then. He did not bother with pleasantries. You're doing exactly what we said you would do, he said. Turning a simple administrative matter into a referendum on family trust. Some of us have to actually manage things instead of analyzing everyone's feelings about them. The cold detachment I had been carrying since Barbara arrived settled deeper. I did not defend myself. I did not list all the times I had stayed quiet or offered help without being asked. I simply said, I'm not asking for a referendum. I'm telling you I know what the agreement was and that it ends here. My father spoke again, his voice still measured. We've always done what we thought was best for everyone. Including you. Your brother and I have carried more of the practical weight. That's not an accusation. It's just how it worked out. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said the words I had not planned but knew were true the second they left my mouth. I'm not coming to the rest of the weekend plans. And I won't be part of any more decisions until there is full transparency about what has already been decided without me. If that means I lose access to things that were supposed to be shared, then that is the cost. My older brother made a sound that could have been a laugh or a sigh. You're choosing to make this difficult. That's on you. I ended the call without answering. The cottage was quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and sent another shower of leaves onto the water. I stood at the window for a long time, watching them drift. The recording had not changed what I already knew. It had only removed the last excuse I had given myself for staying loyal to a version of the family that had never included me as an equal. I packed my bag slowly. There was no rush. The drive back would take several hours, and I had nowhere I needed to be until Monday. As I folded the last shirt, my phone lit up with a text from my mother. She had not been on the call. She wrote only that she hoped I was all right and that family was complicated sometimes. I did not reply right away. I finished packing, carried the bag to the car, and stood for one more minute on the porch. The sense of being truly included had already begun to slip. It was not a dramatic break. It was the quiet recognition that it had never been fully there to begin with. I locked the cottage door, got into the car, and started the engine. The road curved away from the lake. I did not look back in the mirror. There would be more conversations ahead, more attempts to smooth what could not be smoothed. I would meet them the same way I had met the recording, steady, without the loyalty that had kept me blind for so long. But first I had to decide what I was willing to lose in order to stop pretending the agreements had ever been about protection. The road back from the Upper Peninsula felt longer than the drive up had been. I kept the radio off and let the quiet fill the car. Every mile gave me space to trace the shape of what I had lost without ever having held it fully. The agreements between my father and my older brother had not been sudden. They had been a slow accumulation of choices that treated my presence as something to be managed rather than welcomed. I had spent years filling in the gaps with loyalty, telling myself that patience would eventually make me part of the inner circle. The recording and the phone call had shown me the circle had never been drawn to include me. When I reached home late that evening, the apartment felt smaller than I remembered. I unpacked slowly, folding the clothes from the cottage as if the ordinary motion could steady something inside me. My phone stayed face down on the counter. I did not want another conversation yet. I needed one more night of the cold detachment before I decided what came next. The letter arrived 2 days later. It was from Barbara Porter, postmarked the day after she had driven up to the cottage. She had not mentioned sending anything when we spoke. Inside the envelope was a single sheet, a photocopy of an old email chain from several years earlier. The subject line was simple: handling family matters going forward. My father had written the first message. He outlined how decisions about shared resources would stay between him and my older brother. He added that it would be cleaner if I remained unaware of the details because I tended to complicate practical steps with unnecessary discussion. My older brother had replied with one line: agreed. She'll accept it once it's done. She always does. I read the page twice. The language was not angry or dramatic. It was administrative. That made the confirmation sharper than any raised voice could have been. They had documented the exclusion the way people document a business procedure. I folded the page and placed it back in the envelope. Then I sat at my kitchen table until the light outside changed from afternoon to evening. The loss settled in a different place than anger would have. It was quieter and more permanent. My mother called that night. She spoke carefully, the way she did when she hoped to smooth something without naming it. She said my father and my older brother were concerned I had misunderstood their intentions. She suggested a family dinner the following weekend so everyone could talk in person. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I would not be coming. I explained that I would no longer participate in decisions about family resources until there was complete transparency about what had already been decided without my knowledge. I did not raise my voice. I did not list grievances. I simply stated the boundary and said I hoped she understood why I needed it. There was a long silence on her end. Then she said, "Your brother thinks you're being dramatic." I told her that what my older brother thought was no longer the measure I used for my own choices. She did not argue further. We ended the call with the kind of polite distance that already felt like the beginning of something smaller. The gradual isolation began in small, ordinary ways. A month later I learned through a cousin that my Aunt Susan had hosted a small gathering to celebrate a property update. I had not been invited. The message came as a casual text: "Sorry you missed it." It was last minute. I replied with a short note wishing everyone well and did not ask for details. 2 weeks after that, a group text about holiday plans appeared without my name included. I watched the messages scroll past on my screen and felt the absence as a fact rather than a wound. The pattern was consistent. When I stopped filling the gaps with loyalty, the gaps remained. My older brother sent one final message in early winter. It was brief and polished. If you want to be part of the family decisions again, the door is open. But it requires trust on both sides. I read it once and deleted it without answering. Trust had already been spent on the version of the family that had never existed for me. Rebuilding it on their terms would have meant returning to the role of the person who accepted being managed. Charlotte Hayes met me for coffee a few weeks later. She did not push for details. She simply asked how I was sleeping. I told her the nights were quieter now. The constant low hum of trying to prove I belonged had stopped. She nodded and said that sometimes the clearest sign of progress was the absence of a fight you no longer needed to win. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then she changed the subject to a trip she was planning, and I listened without the old reflex of wondering whether my absence from family matters would be noticed. The surprised letter from Barbara Porter stayed in a drawer. I did not need to reread it. Its confirmation had already done its work. It had shown me that the control had been deliberate and documented, not a series of misunderstandings. That knowledge removed any remaining obligation I had felt to interpret their actions generously. I had been loyal to people who had treated loyalty as a tool rather than a mutual bond. The cost of that loyalty had been years of shrinking myself to fit inside. Decisions that were never meant to include me. I began to build small, deliberate routines that did not require family consensus. I took walks along the river near my apartment on weekends. I met Charlotte for dinner without checking whether it conflicted with any family calendar. I started a small savings account separate from any shared family accounts and contributed to it without asking permission or offering explanations. These were not dramatic rebellions. They were the steady accumulation of choices that belonged only to me. Months passed. The isolation did not reverse itself. Invitations remained infrequent. When my father called about a minor update on one of the properties, he spoke in the same measured tone he had always used, but the calls grew shorter and less frequent. My older brother stopped sending the administrative texts altogether. The silence was not peaceful at first. It carried the weight of what had been lost. Over time the weight became something I could carry without it defining every day. I still felt the absence on certain evenings, when the light through the windows reminded me of the cottage porch. The sense of being truly included had been an illusion I had maintained for both of us. Letting it go did not bring triumph. It brought a quieter form of steadiness. I no longer waited for a seat that had never been offered. I no longer explained my boundaries to people who had already decided I did not need them. The price was real. I had traded the comfort of belonging for the clarity of knowing exactly where I stood. One clear afternoon in spring I stood at the window of my apartment and watched the river move. The water did not ask permission to flow around obstacles. It simply continued. I thought about the years I had spent assuming that continued loyalty would eventually change the shape of the agreements my father and my older brother had made without me. I had been wrong. Blind loyalty had protected only the people who already held the power. It had cost me the habit of questioning what I was told and the habit of believing I deserved a voice in matters that affected me. Choosing myself had not restored what was never mine. It had given me the ability to stop waiting for it. I had set the boundary and kept it. The family that remained on the other side of that boundary was smaller. The version of me on this side was steadier. That was the exchange. It was not the ending I had once hoped for, but it was one I could live inside without apology. Thank you for listening to my story. If this spoke to you, type respect in the comments.